They called it punishment before they named a price, her father shoving Mara forward while the store bell clanged once. Men drifted from porches and the saloon to stare, their eyes measuring her like grain, their mouths tasting easy cruelty. Someone said obese as if the word were a joke that could bruise less if it sounded clever enough. She was 16. Breath tight, fingers digging crescents into her skirt, wishing the ground would split and swallow every staring boot. Her father announced a mountain man could take her for cash or cattle because a girl who eats must learn hunger. A stranger stepped from the shade with snow in his beard, broad-shouldered, quiet, smelling of pine, horses, and cold rivers. He studied Mara's face, not her shape, and the air changed the way it sometimes does before lightning chooses a tree. Her father named a figure, then another, then laughed when the crowd jeered, pretending this was business and not betrayal. The stranger set a steady price and added one condition, his voice slow, like a man who sharpened words carefully. He said, "The girl rides my horse and eats at my fire today, or there is no deal at all." Laughter rippled, but something mean inside it thinned. The stranger did not smile, and he did not move his boots. Her father waved a hand, calling it theater, saying, "Take her, teach her work, beat the laziness out if necessary." The stranger remained still, answering that he doesn't buy people, he buys contracts, and a contract can keep a cruel man away. That sentence stuck to the air like frost. Even the clerk stopped pretending to sort ledgers and looked over with interest. Her father rolled his eyes and spat, telling the stranger to stop preaching and count out the coins if he had them. The stranger lifted a leather pouch, poured silver into the clerk's pan, and asked for ink while the weight rang true. He said, "The contract names Mara as a partner in my homestead, not property, entitled to wages, rations, and her own bed." Snorts rose from the porch, but the clerk's pen scratched anyway, because silver made men polite where decency never managed to. Mara stared at the paper as if a door had appeared in the air. Her father muttered that it meant nothing. The stranger looked at her father without blinking and said the paper meant she belonged to herself, and he could read aloud. He read that no man could claim her body or labor without consent. The word consent fell like a nail into oak. Her father grabbed Mara's arm, squeezing, hissing that she would ruin him if she played along with this mountain sermon nonsense. Mara said with a voice she barely recognized that she could not ruin what he already sold for the price of cattle salt. Someone coughed, someone laughed smaller, and the stranger unrolled a second paper for the sheriff to witness if the law required a show. The sheriff pretended to be busy, but he signed because silver stacked beside his coffee, and the town preferred order to storms. The stranger lifted his coat and settled it around Mara's shoulders, the weight soft as a promise and heavy as a vow. He said her road begins at my door if she wants it. If not, say no, and I will leave alone. Mara heard the word want and felt it lift a little inside her chest, like a bird that still remembered sky. Her father barked that she wanted cake and laziness and foolish fantasy, that she would starve in a week on the mountain. The stranger answered that starvation begins in houses where love is rationed and ends in cabins where work earns bread and dignity. Mara stepped toward the horse, knees shaking, and touched its mane. The animal breathed warm, steady, and did not flinch from her hands. She said she would ride, not because she was brave, but because going back down the steps felt like dying very slowly. The crowd parted the way a creek splits around a rock. Their eyes were different now, curious where they had been cruel. The stranger asked her name, and when she said Mara, he nodded as if it was a tool he already knew to use. He said, "I am Calder to people who need a name, and simply man to the ones who judge without looking twice." He helped her to the saddle, not lifting, only bracing, and told her to breathe like hauling water, slow, useful, unashamed. Her father shouted that the deal wasn't blessed, that God would spit out such paper, that no daughter could refuse a father's command. Calder turned his head and said, God was watching who traded children and who set them free, then touched his hat to the sky. Mara felt the coat warm as the horse stepped forward. The town fell behind like a fever she might finally sweat out. At the edge of the street, someone called that a mountain man would break her. Calder said only habits break when work begins. They rode until Widow's Crossing shrank to a smear of board and dust, until the hills opened like patient hands receiving a burden. Mara looked back once and saw her father counting coins that somehow still looked like stones he could not stop swallowing. She looked forward and asked what partner meant when a girl could barely climb stairs without breath. Calder said it meant learning every day. He said there are traps to set, ledgers to keep, and rivers to cross, and your weight is a measure of living, not shame. Mara swallowed hard and let the wind strip the town noise from her ears, hearing only hooves, coat, and a new word forming partner. Calder said we begin with supper and a fire, and tomorrow with work, and the mountain will decide what is worth keeping. Mara kept her eyes on the line of trees lifting from snow, and answered begin, because silence had never saved her yet. Tonight. The trail to Calder's homestead cut through pine so tall their tops vanished into cloud, the air rich with resin and cold river scent. Mara's thighs ached from riding, but she kept her hands steady on the saddle horn, refusing to show weakness. Not to him, not to herself. The dog that had trotted alongside since town kept glancing back at her as if measuring her stamina. Calder rode ahead most of the way, speaking only when the trail narrowed or a branch hung low. When he did, it was never to scold, only to teach. Lean forward here, or the horse will think you are asking him to stop. Keep your knees soft. Mountains don't care for stiff riders. By the time the sky blushed with the last light of day, they reached a clearing where a squat log cabin sat against the backdrop of a sheer rock face, smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. Chickens clucked from a pen to the left, and a neat stack of split logs waited under the overhang. Mara expected the inside to smell of unwashed wool and damp boots, but when Calder opened the door, the scent of sage and roasting meat drifted out to meet her. He let her step in first. The cabin was one large room. Bed in one corner, table near the hearth, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, and a workbench covered in traps, tools, and folded maps. She stood awkwardly in the center until he pointed to a hook by the door. Coat goes there, boots by the wall. If you're staying, you learn where things belong. And if I'm not? She asked, unable to stop herself. Calder shrugged. Then you leave in the morning. The trail's the same either way. But if you stay, you work for your place here. No exceptions. Mara slipped out of the coat and hung it on the hook. Her father's house had hooks too, but they'd always been empty. He preferred his things scattered, making others pick up after him. Calder ladled stew from a pot into 2 bowls, sliding one across the table. Eat, he said. You'll need the strength tomorrow. She hesitated. You're not going to... Her words trailed off, heat rushing to her face. He looked up sharply, understanding without needing her to finish. No, he said flatly. What you were told about men like me, those are stories for people who've never worked a winter here. I bought the contract to keep you out of your father's reach, not to own you. She gripped the spoon and took a bite, the warmth hitting her empty stomach like a spark catching dry tinder. Why? He leaned back in his chair. Because I saw the way you looked at the road out of town, Like you'd rather starve in the hills than eat another meal under his roof. I know that look. You ran too? Calder didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the fire. Not at 16. But I learned early what it's worth to have your own name and keep it. You do the work here. You'll earn wages. At the end of winter, if you want to go, you'll leave with coin. And a reference. She almost laughed. A reference for what? For anything, he said. Cooking, trapping, tending animals. You'll have choices. That's more than your father wanted for you. Mara set her spoon down slowly. My name's Mara Finch, but I'm not sure it feels like mine anymore. Calder nodded. Names get taken, same as land or food. You earn it back piece by piece. By spring you might find a better one. She didn't know if he meant a nickname or something larger, but the idea warmed her in a way the stew couldn't. Later, as she curled under a heavy wool blanket in a bed he'd set up near the hearth, she listened to the wind against the cabin walls and the steady rhythm of his knife sharpening at the workbench. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without the echo of her father's voice chasing her. And somewhere in the night, she dreamed of signing her name to something she chose. Mara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots moving across the cabin floor. The fire was already stoked high, casting a gold light over the walls. Calder was at the table, rolling strips of leather between his hands. Up, he said without looking at her. We've work before the snow softens. She sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. What work? The kind that feeds you. Chickens first, then traps. She thought he meant for her to watch, but he was already setting a pair of worn boots by her bed. They'll do until you can buy your own. The boots were heavy, lined with fur at the top, and far too big. She slid them on anyway. Outside, the morning air bit her cheeks, and the frost crunched underfoot. Calder handed her a wooden bucket. Eggs go in here. Don't break them. And don't let the rooster corner you. He bites. She thought he was joking until the rooster charged. She squeaked and darted around the pen, clutching the bucket to her chest while feathers flashed and claws scraped at the frozen dirt. Calder leaned on the fence, hiding a smirk. You'll learn to stand your ground, he said when she emerged with the bucket half full and her braid a mess. Roosters can smell fear. She muttered something under her breath, but a reluctant spark of pride warmed her as she set the eggs on the table inside. She'd never been trusted to carry anything fragile before. After breakfast, he led her into the forest, the dog trotting ahead. The air was sharp, and the light came down through the branches in shifting patches. Calder showed her how to spot animal tracks, 2 clean hoof prints for deer, a staggered pad pattern for fox. They came to a small stream, its edges frozen in jagged glass, where a metal trap sat under a dusting of snow. A rabbit struggled inside, kicking weakly. Mara froze. Calder crouched and snapped the mechanism open, lifting the animal gently. It's still alive. We'll fix the leg, then release it. Release it? She frowned. I thought traps were for, eating, he said. Sometimes. Not today. A healthy forest needs more than people taking from it. He handed the rabbit to her, its small heart thudding fast against her hands. Hold it steady. She did, surprised at how warm and fragile it felt. By the time they returned to the cabin, the rabbit's leg was splinted with a strip of cloth, and Calder set it in a crate lined with straw. You'll check it each morning, he said. That's your job now. Mara glanced at him. Why are you teaching me this? Calder's eyes softened, though his voice stayed even. Because your father called you useless. And he's wrong. You just haven't been given anything worth doing yet. The words settled deep in her chest, heavier than the bucket of eggs had been. That evening, she sat by the fire, watching the rabbit nibble at a piece of carrot. Calder worked quietly at the table, carving something from a block of wood. When he finally pushed it toward her, she saw it was a small plaque with her name, M-A-R-A, etched deep in the grain. "Hang it above your bed," he said. "Reminds you this place knows who you are." She traced the letters with her fingertips, unsure whether to thank him or cry. In town, her name had been something to mock. Here, it was something he'd carved with his own hands. That night, as the wind scraped over the roof, she thought of her father's face when she'd left, the coins clinking in his palm. For the first time, she wondered if maybe it wasn't she who had been sold cheap, but him, selling away the one thing he'd never get back. 3 days into her new life, the snow broke just enough for horse tracks to appear on the road leading to the cabin. Calder spotted them before Mara did, crouching low near the fence and touching the impressions with his gloved fingers. "Fresh," he murmured. "Whoever it was passed here within the hour." Mara's stomach tightened. "Friends of yours?" "Not likely." He straightened, scanning the tree line. "Stay inside. Keep the door barred until I call." But she didn't have to wait long. A horse clopped into view, its rider a tall man in a brown duster with a badge glinting on his chest. The sheriff. Calder met him halfway down the path, and their voices carried in the still air. Mara couldn't help creeping to the doorway, pressing her ear to the gap in the wood. "You made quite a stir in town," the sheriff said. "Buying a girl like that, then scribbling up a fancy contract. Her father's been raising a fuss. Claims you swindled him." "I didn't swindle him," Calder replied evenly. "I outbid the saloon keeper. There's a difference." "Difference or not, the man's talking lawsuit. He says she's underage, can't sign a contract." Calder's tone sharpened. "She's 16. Old enough to be married off in this territory, but somehow not old enough to work for wages? Convenient law you're quoting." The sheriff cleared his throat. "All I'm saying is, the whole town's watching. They think you've got intentions." Calder's voice went cold. "My intention is to keep her alive through the winter. If the town's worried about her welfare, maybe they should have stepped in before her father auctioned her off like a mule." The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "Still, you should know. He's talking about coming up here. Maybe with others. Men who don't care about papers." Mara's grip on the doorframe tightened until her knuckles ached. Calder said nothing for a moment, then, "Tell him if he comes, he'd better bring more than words." The sheriff gave a slow nod, wheeled his horse, and rode back the way he'd come. Calder didn't look toward the cabin until the sound of hooves faded completely. When he did, Mara was already on the porch. "He's coming here?" she asked. Calder's gaze met hers, calm but unyielding. "Possibly, which means we prepare." "For what? A fight?" "For anything." He led her to the shed, pulling open the heavy door to reveal rows of tools, axes, shovels, even a rifle polished to a dull shine. He handed her a hatchet. "Start splitting kindling. The more wood we've got stacked, the less time we'll need outside if trouble comes." She set to work, the rhythmic crack of wood matching the thud in her chest. Hours later, as the sun dipped low, Calder joined her by the fire pit. "The sheriff was right about one thing," he said. "Your father doesn't care about losing you. He cares about losing face. Men like that can't stand the idea someone else made a better deal." Mara stabbed another log into the ground. "So, what happens if he shows up?" Calder glanced toward the trail, where the last light painted the snow a deep gold. "Then we remind him you're not part of his deal anymore." That night, Mara lay awake long after Calder's breathing slowed from across the room. She stared at the wooden plaque above her bed, tracing her name in the dark with one fingertip. For the first time, She felt the faintest thread of ownership over it, thin but strong enough to hold if someone tried to pull it away. But she also knew something now. Her father wouldn't just let her keep it. He would come to take it back. And when he did, she would have to decide whether to hide behind Calder or stand beside him. The snow fell heavy for 2 more days, sealing the trail in white silence, and Mara settled into a rhythm, feeding the chickens, checking the rabbit's splint, splitting kindling until her shoulders ached in ways that felt almost good, while Calder worked alongside her, speaking little, his focus on the traps and the maps that seemed to shift each evening on the table. On the 3rd morning, the quiet broke when old Bristle, Calder's dog, lifted his head and growled toward the ridge, moments before the crunch of hooves carried through the frozen air. Calder grabbed his rifle but didn't raise it, telling her to stay inside, though she stood at the window anyway as a lone rider approached. A wiry stable hand from the auction, eyes darting like he'd been paid to keep secrets, dismounted and handed Calder a small leather pouch. Calder loosened the drawstring and pulled out a folded paper sealed in red wax. The imprint of her father's ring pressed deep and broke it without ceremony to read in silence before passing it to her. The note was short. "Return the girl within a fortnight, or I will come for what's mine, with men who will not be as polite as your sheriff." Mara's stomach turned to stone as she whispered that he was serious, and Calder nodded, saying her father was impatient and meant to catch them before winter roads closed. But when she suggested giving herself back, Calder's stare cut her mid-sentence as he told her running home would only mean being sold again or locked away until she was thin enough to parade, and that wasn't life but a sentence. When she asked what they should do, he glanced toward the ridge and said they'd prepare and send their own message back, pulling an old saddlebag from under the workbench, dropping the letter inside, and writing a reply she couldn't read before sealing it in plain wax and handing it to the stable hand, with the warning to tell her father he'd better bring more than words. After the man rode off, Mara stood by the fire, asking what he'd written, and Calder poured coffee, as he told her he'd said she wasn't her father's to claim, and that if men came, they'd better bring shovels because the ground was hard this time of year. She didn't know whether to feel safer or more afraid, thinking of the rooster in the pen, and how Calder had told her to stand her ground. Maybe this was the same thing, only sharper, with fewer rules. That night, as the wind rose and rattled the cabin walls, she lay awake, listening to Bristle's low growl by the door, and imagining her father reading Calder's words, knowing they would pull him up the mountain faster than any letter begging for mercy ever could. 2 mornings later, with the sky a hard white and the air still as glass, a knock came at the cabin door. Not the heavy, demanding thud of a man's fist, but 3 quick raps, sharp and certain. And when Calder opened it without reaching for the rifle, a tall woman stepped inside as if she owned the floorboards, wearing a patched buffalo coat with black hair streaked silver and braided down her back. Her dark, steady eyes sweeping the room before settling on Mara, as she said in a low, certain voice, "So, this is the girl your father wants back." Mara stiffened and asked who she was, and the woman dropped a leather satchel onto the table, introducing herself as Elsie 2 Rivers, a trapper out of Elk Pass, who traded in town when the snow allowed, and Calder added that she was the best scout in these hills, knowing every pass, shortcut, and ambush site. Elsie unrolled a worn map, tapping 2 points as she explained that her father's men would either come straight up the road, like fools, or along the south ridge where the snow crust would hold them, giving them only 3 or 4 days before they reached the cabin. Mara's pulse thudded as she asked if they were just waiting, but Elsie replied that waiting was what prey did, and that they would prepare, asking Calder if he had snares and oil, then turning to Mara to say she would learn to move quietly so she could reach the north slope unseen if trouble came. They spent the afternoon outside with Elsie teaching her how to step where the snow wouldn't squeal, how to use trees to hide her outline, and how to breathe through her nose so her breath wouldn't give her away. And though she stumbled at first, by dusk she could cross the clearing without making Bristle lift his head. Over stew that evening, Elsie told half English, half Lakota stories of winters spent without seeing another soul and outsmarting men who thought the mountains would keep their secrets. Her voice calm and certain in a way that came not from boasting, but from surviving. Later, as Calder checked the locks, Elsie caught Mara's gaze and said her father was counting on her being afraid. But fear could be used to keep her eyes open rather than her feet still. And as they all settled into their bedrolls, Mara lay awake thinking about those words, realizing how often she had let fear shrink her, and wondering if this time she could make it work for her instead. Just before she drifted off, she heard Elsie murmur something to Calder in Lakota, his answer low and sure. And in the silence that followed, she felt the weight of plans forming like stones laid in a foundation. Preparations for men already on their way, and perhaps the beginnings of a version of herself she had never been allowed to meet. By the next afternoon, the wind had shifted, bringing with it a sharpness that told Elsie the weather would turn before nightfall, and she was outside with Calder studying the ridge when Bristle gave a low, guttural bark that wasn't his usual warning for deer or fox. Mara came to the doorway just in time to see Elsie raise her hand for silence, her eyes locked on a dark line moving against the pale snow far up on the south slope. Tiny figures but steady, purposeful, cutting across the crust exactly where she'd predicted. 4 men, maybe 5, Elsie murmured, keeping close enough to use the tree line for cover. Calder's jaw tightened as he told Mara to stay inside and bar the door, but she shook her head, unwilling to be shut away like cargo again, and he gave her a look that lingered a moment before he said, "Then you do exactly as we've drilled." Elsie moved fast, fetching the snares and oil-soaked rags from the shed, while Calder positioned them along the narrow approach, brushing fresh snow over the disturbed spots so nothing would show. Mara's job was to run the north slope path if Calder called for it, slipping into the brush to wait at the rock overhang until Elsie or Calder came for her. She kept her eyes on the ridge while they worked, her heart thudding each time the figures dipped from view and reappeared farther along. By the time the sun was a pale coin in the west, the traps were set, the oil laid in hidden streaks where boots would slide, and the cabin darkened inside except for the low glow of the banked fire. They waited. Hours stretched, the only sounds the faint creak of settling wood and Bristle's slow pacing by the door. It was near midnight when the first crunch of snow came from the trail, measured, deliberate, closer than she expected, and Elsie, crouched by the window, lifted 2 fingers to Calder. He nodded, stepped outside without a sound, and melted into the darkness. Mara's throat tightened as she heard muffled voices, low and male, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakably confident, like men who believed they were walking toward an easy prize. Then came a sudden scuffle, the sharp hiss of boots slipping on oiled snow, a grunt, and a crash through the underbrush followed by Calder's voice, cold and hard. "Tell your boss that's the first warning. The next one puts you in the ground." The retreat was clumsy, angry muttering fading up the trail until only the wind remained. Calder reappeared in the doorway, brushing snow from his coat, his breath steady as if he'd been splitting wood, not facing down armed men. "They won't stop," Elsie said quietly. "No," he agreed, looking at Mara, "but now they know we're watching." Mara realized she was gripping the wooden plaque above her bed, her fingertips pressed into the grooves of her name, and she let go slowly, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. They had come within yards of the door tonight. And she had not run. For the first time, she thought maybe her father was wrong about more than her worth, Maybe he had no idea who she was becoming. Outside, the ridge lay quiet again. But in the cabin, the air felt charged, as if the walls themselves understood that this was only the beginning. The following day dawned under a dull sky that pressed low over the pines, the air heavy with the threat of more snow. And Mara moved through her chores with restless energy, glancing often toward the ridge as if expecting the figures to reappear. Elsie left before sunrise to scout their trail, promising to be back by midday, and Calder kept busy repairing a section of the fence, though Mara could tell by the way his eyes kept drifting to the tree line that his mind was nowhere near the task. She was gathering eggs when Bristle's bark split the quiet, sharp, and insistent this time, and Calder dropped the hammer, striding toward the cabin as a flicker of orange glowed against the white beyond the trees. Smoke. Mara's breath caught as she saw it too, thin at first, then swelling into a thicker plume, and Calder didn't have to say it before she knew. Someone had set a fire. They moved fast, Calder grabbing the rifle and a bucket, shoving another into her hands as they ran toward the thin column. The snow was deep, slowing her, but by the time they broke through the pines into the clearing, the source was clear. A haystack near the shed was ablaze, flames licking upward with a hunger that made the surrounding air crackle. Calder didn't waste time swearing. He plunged the bucket into the trough, flinging water onto the base while Mara mirrored him, the steam rising in frantic bursts. Bristle circled, barking, and through the smoke Mara thought she saw movement. 2 men retreating toward the tree line, one glancing back with a grin before vanishing into the shadows. Calder saw it too, his voice cutting through the roar of fire. "They're testing us!" The heat stung Mara's face, but she kept working, darting back and forth until the flames hissed down to embers, the hay nothing more than a blackened heap. They stood there panting, their breath making quick white clouds, and Calder kicked at the remains, scattering them so nothing could reignite. "Why burn the hay?" Mara asked. "To send a message," he said grimly. "They want us tired, shaken. They want us to know they can get close." As they walked back to the cabin, Mara's legs trembled, not from cold, but from the knowledge that this was more than a threat now. It was a game her father's men intended to escalate. Elsie returned before dark, her coat dusted with snow, and listened in silence as Calder told her what happened. When he finished, she nodded once, her jaw tight. "Then we changed the rules," she said. She spread her map on the table, marking spots with quick slashes of charcoal. "Tonight we set snares closer in. We light no fire inside, and we keep watch in shifts, one inside, one out." Mara found herself volunteering for the first watch without thinking, and neither Calder nor Elsie argued. So when darkness settled thick over the pass, Mara stood in the shadow of the cabin, Bristle at her side, the cold biting through her coat as she kept her eyes on the dark smear of the tree line. Hours passed, the snow falling in lazy spirals, and she thought she saw movement more than once, shapes too large for deer, too careful for wandering travelers. But none came close. When she finally woke Calder for his turn, her fingers were stiff and her cheeks numb, but there was a strange satisfaction in having kept her post. As she crawled into her bedroll, she glanced at the plaque with her name and realized she was beginning to feel like it belonged here, carved into this place as much as into the wood. She didn't know if her father's men would come tomorrow or next week, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't be the same girl they'd seen at the auction. By the 4th night after the fire, the mountains had gone unnervingly quiet, the kind of stillness that made even Bristle's ears twitch at shadows, and Calder said it meant only one thing. Men were close enough to know the lay of the land and patient enough to wait for the right moment. Elsie came back from her ridge watch at dusk, her breath steaming as she tossed her gloves on the table. "They're camped half a mile out, just beyond the big cedar grove," she said, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she'd been describing the weather. 4 men, Maybe 5. Horses tied, no fire. They're waiting for dark to cover their approach. Calder didn't flinch. Then we make it their last one. The plan came together quickly. Elsie would take the north slope, cutting off any who tried to circle wide, while Calder held the trail to the cabin. Mara was to stay hidden in the root cellar, unless he called for her, but she shook her head before he even finished the sentence. "If they get past you, they'll find me anyway," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Better I'm where I can help." For a long moment, Calder studied her, then gave a single nod. They spent the next hour readying what they could, spreading more oil on the steepest section of the trail, checking the rifle and the hatchet, setting a lantern inside the window to make it look as if someone were sitting still by the fire. The snow began again just after sunset, fat flakes swirling down to soften the world into muffled white, and when it was full dark, the first sound came. A careful crunch, then another, measured steps moving up the trail. Bristle's low growl was all the warning they got before shadows detached from the tree line, fanning into the clearing. Calder moved like a part of the night itself, stepping out from behind the shed with the rifle leveled, his voice cutting cold through the snow. "You can turn around now, or you can find out how deep the ground freezes here." One of the men laughed, stepping forward into the lantern's glow, and Mara recognized the sharp, wolfish grin from the fire, one of the pair who'd fled that day. "We're here for the girl," he called. "Not you." Calder's answer was the rifle shot that cracked the air, a bullet slamming into the snow inches from the man's boots. The clearing erupted, men shouting, boots slipping on oiled ground, Elsie's whistle slicing through the chaos from the north slope as she flushed one rider's horse into a panicked bolt. Mara stayed low by the doorway, hatchet in hand, her breath fast and hot against the cold air, until one man broke from the fray and came straight toward her. She didn't think. She stepped into his path, swinging the hatchet down to bite into the snow just in front of his knee, forcing him to stumble back with a curse. Calder was there in an instant, the rifle's barrel pressed to the man's chest until he backed away, muttering. Within minutes, it was over, the men retreating into the trees, leaving only trampled snow and the echo of their anger behind. Calder lowered the rifle slowly, scanning the dark to be sure they were gone, then looked at Mara. "You kept your ground," he said simply. She swallowed hard, nodding, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. But deep inside, she knew tonight was only a reprieve. Her father wouldn't take this loss quietly, and the next time, he might come himself. The snowstorm came with the dawn, a white wall swallowing the ridge and burying every sound under its heavy hush. And while Mara hoped it might keep her father's men from making another push, Calder trusted no storm to save anyone. So all morning they worked, shoveling paths to the sheds, breaking ice from the trough, checking the snares Elsie had set before the weather closed in, until by midday the wind had narrowed visibility to a few yards, and that was when they heard it. The faint crunch of boots, muffled by the storm, yet close enough that Bristle's head snapped toward the trail. Calder and Elsie exchanged a quick look and moved fast, but when Calder motioned Mara toward the cabin, she refused, staying close as 3 figures emerged from the swirling white, their coats dusted in snow, rifles slung, one carrying a length of rope swinging from his fist, and even before their faces cleared, she knew the man in the lead. The sharp jaw, the same eyes that had glared over a supper table when she was 12, the same eyes that had looked her over at the auction as if she were livestock. Her father. He stopped 10 paces from the cabin, snow curling around his boots, and called out over the wind that Calder had had his fun, and now it was time to hand her over because she belonged to him. But Calder stepped forward with his rifle steady, saying she wasn't his anymore, and when her father's smile dropped into a glare and he spat that she was a burden who needed to be sold to someone who could make use of her. Mara stepped out from behind Calder, the wind whipping her words but not their meaning, as she told him she wasn't a burden and she wasn't his. And when he sneered that Calder was just another fool in the mountains, Bristle lunged forward, barking with such fury the horses reared, and Elsie appeared from the swirling snow behind them with her bow drawn, warning that they would leave now or leave in the ground. For a long, frozen moment, her father's eyes moved between Calder's rifle, Elsie's arrow, the snarling dog, and Mara herself standing taller than he had ever allowed her to. And then he spat into the snow, turned, and walked back into the storm with his men trailing, fading into the white, until nothing remained but the wind. Inside, the fire crackled, and heat stung her cheeks, as Calder watched her with that quiet, measuring look, and told her she hadn't run, and she answered that she never would. Not from him. Not anymore. While Elsie smirked from her chair, saying the mountain had claimed her, and never let go easy. And Mara glanced toward the window, where the snow swept past in endless white, feeling for the first time that it wasn't a prison, but a home. Knowing her father might try again one day, but that he would not find the frightened girl from the auction. He would find a woman who had learned to stand her ground in the snow with the mountain at her back.